Hi, I'm Malika Bilal. 100 leading Africans have written to Eritrea's president, Isaias Afwerki, urging him to embark on political reforms. But will it make a difference?
I'm Ahmed Chabuldin. Make sure to tweet us during the show at AJ Stream, or you can leave your comments in our live YouTube chat, and you too could be in the stream.
It was a peace deal that took many by surprise. In July of last year, Eritrea's president, Isaias Afwerki, traveled to Ethiopia, where he was met with hugs by Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The Horn of African nations had fought a war from 1998 to 2000, in which more than 80,000 people died and had been in a state of Cold War ever since. Eritrea, which has held no elections since Isaias came to power in 1993 and has jailed politicians and journalists, has often justified its policies by saying they are necessary to protect it from attack or sabotage from Ethiopia.
But with a peace agreement now signed, opposition activists say the time is right for change. Young Eritreans have started social media campaigns such as Yaakel or Enough. And last week, a group of 100 leading Africans wrote an open letter to President Isaias asking him to start political reforms and release what they called political prisoners. John Githongo, a Kenyan journalist, told us where the idea came from. Take a look at this.
In October 2018, Raphael and I found ourselves at a Pan-African conference on corruption, and it struck us that we've been attending these kind of events and discussing corruption, but never bumping into our brothers and sisters from Eritrea. And when we asked ourselves why, it became clear that some of the people who we would have wanted there were incarcerated or in exile from Eritrea. And so we thought, what can we do about this as Africans, a Pan-African initiative? And that's where the Pan-African Solidarity for Eritrea came from.
So can initiatives like this and Yaakel have any real impact? Joining us to discuss this, Salem Solomon is a journalist with Voice of America here in Washington, D.C., who covers Eritrea extensively. Rahel Weldiab-Sebhatu is a political scientist and research lead for the African Youth Leadership Program, AfResist. And Vanessa Tsahai is a campaigner and human rights activist who's also joining us. Welcome, everyone.
So let's get started with that letter that Ahmed mentioned and we heard in the video comment there. I pulled it up on my screen here and you'll see it on your screens as well. It begins, it's a long letter and it seems like a real instance of Pan-African solidarity, so you can see where it begins there, but I'm going to just pull out a couple of points. So we trust that by opening this channel of communication with Your Excellency, we may be afforded the opportunity to work with you to restore your country and the great people of Eritrea to their rightful place in the family of African nations. And it goes on there. And of course, this is an open letter to the president. So Salem, when you got word of this letter, what was your initial reaction?
My initial reaction is it's very, as a journalist, we see the solidarity coming from, really renowned intellectuals, African intellectuals like Wole Soyinka of Nigeria, who is very revered, Kenyan activists who are fighting for pro-democratic movements in their home countries. But it is in addition to what Eritreans, young Eritreans who are residing in the West and in Western Europe and in the United States, born and raised here, they're calling for the same freedoms and democratic systems that they are privileged to live in. They want the same for their counterparts in Eritrea. That's what they're calling for. So it's in addition to what Eritreans have been calling. So it's very interesting to watch. And I've covered the country for a very long time. This is the first time we're seeing the fear being removed. People are showing their faces, they're showing their names, and recording videos to call for what they say is enough of authoritarian rule in Eritrea.
Well, we actually have one of those videos that maybe we can play out for our audience, just to your point directly. This came into us from Eden here in America, one of those Eritreans in the diaspora. Let's take a listen.
I joined the Yaakel movement because I realized these private conversations at home just aren't impactful enough. There are hundreds and thousands of people that are unaware of the current climate of Eritrea, that we have been ruled by dictator Isaias Afwerki for 28 years, which he was never elected for that position, that our journalists have been imprisoned for decades without a trial, that there is no freedom of press, that there are no civilians because everyone is forced to join the indefinite military service at the age of 17, where they are robbed of their youth, raped, and faced with traumas. We say ya'akal. Enough is enough.
So Rahel, you heard the list of grievances there. When it comes to what people in the diaspora are saying, they seem to line up with what members of the signatories of that letter that we mentioned had to say. But of note, there are no Eritreans on the signatories. What did you make of the letter, Rahel?
Well, as an avid Pan-Africanist who has been involved in the Pan-African related activities and campaigns for more than 10 years, my initial feeling about the letter was that it came out as being very audacious and kind of smug in a way. There is a history, of sort of precarious history that Eritrea has had with Pan-African movement, the Pan-African movement, especially for political decolonization, where they were not vocal at all in relation to the Eritrean struggle and various atrocities that happened after that. The fact that there's no Eritrean signatories on this letter doesn't really bother me in particular. It's just that what I found a bit upsetting was that it's clear to me that the majority of those signatories have no idea of what's going on in Eritrea or its history. I understand that the letter was drafted by two people and then they went around and gathered these signatories. Of course, reading it without any proper information or context, it looks like an innocent letter, right? Who doesn't want democracy? Who doesn't want reform? But it would have been better if they would have actually contacted their compatriots in the country or even in the diaspora to get further information before signing such a audacious letter.
Vanessa, I'm curious to get your thoughts. I mean, a lot of the comments that we have coming in are actually also in support of the government there in Eritrea. And, when it comes to the letter, Fela Sol, is tweeting, and there's a conversation that's playing out that's kind of reflecting what I would say is a generational divide. She's saying, I can only assume that the Enough movement, the attention it's begun to receive exposing the atrocities in Eritrea, had great influence in the timing of the letter to essayists. Strength in numbers, the time to apply pressure is now, collectively, for Eritreans and a stronger Africa. And then there's a response from Segi Antonio saying, I don't even know if you're born in Eritrea, you're too young to say these words. It's easy to say some things that we don't know. Ask your father, he grew up. I assure you, things are better now than they were. The government's doing the maximum. I don't know what your thoughts are on his specific points, but what can you share with us about the generational divide and some of what we heard from Rahel about her kind of defense of the government?
I think a response to this letter that I thought was very interesting from the government side was the focus on the bad timing, the focus on the agenda behind the letter, and the focus on what they were doing before this letter was written. Where were you 30 years ago when we were fighting for independence? Where were you when the Ethiopian government refused to withdraw the troops and assign to the Algeria agreement, rather than focusing on the issues? But I have said that this seems like an innocent letter. Who doesn't want democracy? Who doesn't want the issues and the things that they were raising in this letter? And I'm asking the same question. Who doesn't? The issues that they're raising are not unique. That's just the Pan-African now solidarity for Eritrea has come up with by themselves. And it's not something that us in the diaspora have just manufactured and are now arguing for. We're raising issues that people in Eritrea were raising 18 years ago. People were raising 10 years ago and have been imprisoned because of that. People have been imprisoned without a trial for asking these questions. These are not foreign ideas. We're not agents of colonial or neo-colonial agents or powers. These are our own ideas. And I think it's interesting that the African letter is being accused of being agents of neo-colonial powers when they're Africans. We are accused of being neo-colonial agents, but we're Eritreans. So I'm wondering who has the ability to actually criticize Eritrea without being criticized by pro-government people or by the government of being a neocolonial agent? When do we get agency in asking questions for our own people without being imprisoned?
Vanessa, I hear you there. Salim here wanted to respond, but before you do, I want to share with our audience, because Vanessa mentioned the government's response, so I want to share that with those who aren't in the know just yet. Here's what she's talking about. So take a look at the response. I pulled it up on my screen as well. In it, they write, the majority of the signatories have undoubtedly been influenced by the narratives on Eritrea produced over the last 20 years. None of them have firsthand knowledge of or have ever visited the country. When one skims through the list, there is not even a single individual who has penned one single article on the predicaments of Eritrea in all those decades when it faced enormous existential threats. We got lots of tweets like this as well. So this is one person who says, the more important question that needs to be asked is, why have these quote unquote prominent Africans been absent and silent the last decade and a half when Eritrea had been continuously harassed and terrorized? And here they call the terrorist group, which is the Armed Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. Salim, what's your take on that?
Well, I would like to go back to what Rahel said about being audacious. Yes, it's audacious to ask for the conditions of prisons that Vanessa's uncle, Suyum Tsahaye, who happens to be the longest jailed journalist on the continent. These are facts that are that show the true nature of how people are treated. We're talking about reporters that have disappeared. Family members like Vanessa and others that I speak to tell me, if they are dead, let us know so we can have closure. These are the specific questions that people ask me. I speak to victims all the time. Recently, when I was working on a story about a reporter who spent 6 years of her life for writing poetry. I mean, they were accused of listening to an opposition radio station in Ethiopia, for instance. These are the voices that they are trying to highlight. In fact, the signatories specifically said, our most important question and what we want to see is, let us visit our counterparts. These are pro-democracy activists, pro-democracy intellectuals that are active in their home countries, been imprisoned for speaking up against authoritarian government. And so they want to see their counterparts, journalists, parliamentarians who were arrested during the crackdown. But that's what we're talking about. In the past year, we have seen more crackdown of former officials, government officials, broad daylight being arrested. And so a lot of people thought this peace would bring some sort of change, but we're seeing more crackdown on religious institutions, the economy, and individuals.
And it seems when people are asking about when the change might come, the government is kind of delaying it and just towing the line, saying it's too soon. It's only been a year since this peace deal was reached. On Twitter, there are people who are saying something like this, for example, I do not support the Enough campaign as it is a misguided barrage of emotions barking at the wrong tree. Rahel, I see that you're nodding. Maybe you agree with that. But Vanessa, because we heard from Salim about your uncle, and I know that's how you got into this activism in the first place, I'm curious, when you see these tweets that, dismissing the campaign as misguided barrage of emotions, what do you make of that?
I see privilege. I see a lot of people based in the diaspora who themselves or their children are enjoying the very benefits of democracy, of human rights. People who don't oppose human rights as a principle, they believe in human rights. A lot of them, like Rahel here, are Pan-Africanists who believe in the rights of African people. But somehow when it comes to Eritrea, there's an exception. Somehow when it comes to Eritrea, there is a reason. There is sanctions, there's a war. There's always a reason that makes Eritrean people in Eritrea excluded from these privileges and rights that all human beings are supposed to be guarded by and be a part of. And I simply do not understand at this point how anyone can be advocating for a government that has been removing these privileges from our own people, especially after these excuses, because it was simply excuses all along. It was never proportionate to what was actually happening in the country. It was never proportionate to shut down a parliament. It was never proportionate to imprison my uncle and so many other people without a trial. It was never proportionate to make people serve in a national service indefinitely. And it was never proportionate to turn the country into a dictatorship simply because of a standoff at the border. So I see people being misguided by their own privilege and maybe their own ideas of the kind of Eritrea that they wanted and that about the president that they loved at some point, but who did not suffer the consequences.
As you're talking, I want to share with our audience, because I want to give this a slightly more personal touch, because of course this is a very personal issue for you. So I pulled up a photo that you sent our team earlier of your uncle. Talk to us about who's in this photo.
So this photo was taken during the War of Independence, where my uncle was a war photographer who trained other war photographers. They captured a lot of the imageries and videos of the struggle. He was also a teacher at the time and had always been a very adamant pro-democracy human being. He wasn't an activist. He was just a human being fighting not only for independence in Eritrea, but democracy and human rights. And he was actually imprisoned for a year during the War of Independence without a trial for these very vocal opinions. And when independence came, he was also seen as a threat and demoted from being the director of the national television channel to the Ministry of Tourism, eventually becoming a freelance journalist focusing on the well-being of the Eritrean people. And in the crack of, so in 2001, when the Eritrean government, a week after 9/11, shut down the free press, they started imprisoning people who, only from our perspective, because there was never a trial, we think were seen as a threat towards their power. So my uncle was one of them, 1 out of 10 journalists and a group of politicians, and who've all been imprisoned ever since. And that was, as some activists have called it, or Eritreans, the beginning of the Eritrean dictatorship. And that was, my uncle was one of the journalists then who was in prison.
Well, you know, Vanessa, just hearing you talk about your uncle and his legacy and what he's done to train journalists, we have Tem Sagan on Twitter chiming in and kind of countering a point that was made earlier on the show. I wanted to make sure to get this in. He says, it's worth noting Eritrean writers and activists have already been airing their grievances for years, hence the fact that there weren't Eritreans among the 103 signatories, which he says is irrelevant. The issue remains there is an unelected government playing God with people's lives. And I see, obviously, you're nodding, but Rahel, you know, you see these comments, you see these people who feel as though there's, you know, not enough being done to address this since the peace plan. What is your explanation as to why that's the case?
My explanation has, it's not like, you know, excuses or, you know, what it is, what I would like to bring in this conversation. And when I talk to people, I like to discuss is context. And this is not an excuse for anything that has happened, but when the journalists and the ministers were arrested, it was in 2001, right after the border conflict. It was a very precarious time. But let me reply to this the tweet about emotions. So although it might kind of seem new to viewers that this يأكل campaign is something new, there's been many campaigns with the same type of slogan over the year. There was also the Freedom Friday one that was proved to be just bogus. What we're seeing today is what I refer to and what a lot of theorists, political theorists refer to as a conservative backlash. The peace that has been fostered between the countries has not been easy for people. You know, to transition from, you know, this a hostile to this you know, peaceful situation without
Rahel, do you mind if I just interrupt you? Because I just want to make sure and clarify for our audience. You're saying context is important and there have been many other campaigns. But it seems to me, and obviously, you know, I'm not as plugged in as maybe you or others, you know, it seems to us that some people like Rora Habab on Twitter are saying this is different because it's actually reaching the streets of Eritrea. The naysayers thought يأكل was only in the diaspora. They thought we were foolish for pushing for change when the people back home stayed silent. They thought the people back home would never resist. And then she's sharing these pictures of, you know, the campaign slogan written on the walls there in Eritrea. Is this something that you've seen before? Does this suggest perhaps that this movement's different?
Not really. I have seen things like that before, you know, different posters that might have gone up. There were robocalls that would, you know, basically terrorize people out of their sleep, coming in from outside, telling them that they should stand up and do what have you.
I wasn't talking about robocalls. I was talking about actual graffiti on the streets. Yes. Okay.
It has happened before. You know, when I like to bring up context, I mean, the function of it is to demystify different actions that might take inside of Eritrea and even those in the diaspora. You know, this is it because Eritrea, the dominant discourse has always talked about Eritrea as being a pariah state and isolationist and what have you. we get these pictures and we think that it's, like this really big deal. And it's not. This is something that's happened over many years. And if it's something that's going to continue, that's fine. Let the people do that.
Do you mind if I come in to talk about context? Context is very important. Rahel mentioned that it was a precarious time when the crackdown on journalists happened, but the crackdown didn't stop then. We're talking about the past year. Let's talk about the past year. I just mentioned a reporter, a journalist for a radio station that is owned by the government itself and funded by the Minister of Education, was broadcasting educational programs. And then they were accused of, many of them were arrested and accused of listening to an opposition radio station. Spent 6 years of her life in prison, tortured, beaten, is what she, told me, and now she's in exile. But when we're talking about context, there is no justification that can really, explain these actions. In the past year, right after the peace deal was signed, a prominent, politician who I think smuggled a book outside and published outside was arrested in broad daylight when he was walking down the streets with his son.
So
we were able to confirm this with his family.
I want to share the headline of that because this Amnesty International has a more complete picture of what might have happened there. So you can see this on my screen here. Eritrea released former finance minister immediately and unconditionally. He was allegedly arrested after just a week, really, after writing a book that people have said was deemed critical of the government and critical of the president. So he was arrested just a year ago. So people are saying this is still happening. But I want to share this tweet because it's in line with what you were saying, Salah. Samuel says, in my opinion, the most important and potentially durable achievement of this enough movement, this theatrical movement, is the significant involvement of young Eritreans, both in the diaspora and new immigrants who fled the Eritrean government's suffocating regime of control and suppression. So based on what you're saying and what this tweet is saying, new immigrants, people are still fleeing?
And that's very important to talk about migration as well, because the signatories made a point about migration being, the government said the pull factor. They are not recognizing the push factor. Why are young people leaving? And what are they asking for? Most of the people that I speak to, what they're asking for is the implementation of the Constitution that was ratified in '97. They're asking for freedom of movement. When their Ethiopian counterparts can come visit, all they could do is watch their Ethiopian counterparts come in and go. They had to ask for exit visas. When they're asking for, looking at the specifics of their asks is very illuminating. And I hear a lot of, migrants saying we can't go back. We feel, threatened for our lives. Or they're talking about the limitation of the national service. National service on the Constitution had 18 months. As it is right now, we had colleagues who served and went to school with me and Rahel, actually, still trapped for 10 to 20 years.
And because you bring up migration, I just want to quickly come to you, Rahel. We have this tweet from Philly Tekle live saying, what do they mean when they say things are going okay in Eritrea, responding to some of our community? Why would we move through the Sahara Desert and Libya to Europe? We have a wonderful country, but if they treat us in very horrible ways, we're obligated to leave. Why would thousands of people migrate? Why do you think, Rahel, people are continuing to migrate?
There are a myriad of reasons.
Just one or two.
Especially we're going to tell from a Pan-African perspective, it's definitely not only Eritreans migrating. There's many Africans risking their lives in the hands of human traffickers in order to reach Europe.
Well, to jump in there, I think another point that needs to be made here is the deflection from the issues that are going on that we're discussing. We can talk about the hypocrisy of the West. We can talk about the hypocrisy of African solidarity that is more stronger with certain countries and less with others. We can talk about the fact that some of these people might have been silent 30 years ago. Some of these people weren't even born. Some of these people were imprisoned at the time. We can talk about all these issues, but the Eritrean government is saying that these issues are not even, it's a non-issue. These journalists and politicians that are imprisoned, were, and I quote, not directly quote,
Vanessa,
paraphrase.
I have to pause you there with it being a non-issue. I hear your point, I take your point, and it's one that I know our community will still continue talking about. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation, but we will do future shows on this because it is a hot topic. This conversation will continue online. Don't forget to follow us at AJStream on Twitter and to visit aljazeera.com/thestream for more episodes. Ahmed and I will see you next time.